May the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be now and always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So lying close to the heart of faith, indeed what makes it faith and not certainty, is the idea of paradox. That God is transcendent and majestic and sovereign over all of creation, and that God is immanent and near and hears us when we call. That God is deeply concerned with the keeping of the law and will punish children for the iniquity of their parents to the third and fourth generation. And the steadfast love of the Lord is never ceasing, and God's mercy is everlasting. And God's wisdom is revealed in a foolish proclamation, and God's weakness is stronger than strength. One of the things that faith requires of us is the capacity to hold two opposed ideas and to know that they are both true at the same time. It is ordinary bread and ordinary wine, products of the fruit of field and vine and the work of human hands. And it is the very presence of God in your body and in your life. And the cross, that central moment in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, is foolishness and salvation. Paradox doesn't sit well with the human mind, though we much prefer certainty and simplicity. And yet, the God that is revealed to us throughout the ancient stories of the Hebrew Scriptures and in the life of Jesus and in the writings of the early Christian church and over and over and over again in the words of the poets and storytellers and prophets and students of the human condition, is a God of paradox and contradiction. A God of ongoing self-revelation and of eternal mystery. This is a large part of why there is no theological dissonance for me in welcoming LGBT people into the life of the church, even while other Christians say, the Bible is clear. Because for one thing, the Bible is full of contradiction and paradox. And it is also abundantly clear about the essential belovedness of every child of God. But more than that, as much as the human mind prefers clear and tidy binaries, our God of contradiction and paradox and eternal mystery just doesn't seem to work that way. So a community that has excluded trans and non-binary voices is missing something essential when we try to talk about how God is revealed to us in the Imago Dei, the image of God in which we are all made. To see the fullness of what God is revealing to us about God's self, we have to be able to nurture within ourselves a capacity to live held in the tension between the conflicting truths of a paradox. God is three, and God is one. Paradox lies at the very heart of the nature of God. And so it is no surprise to me when still the poets and the storytellers and the prophets and the research and the students of human nature find these same paradoxes revealed to them in the nature of the world that God made and in the nature of humanity made in God's image. Carl Jung said that in holding the tension of opposites, paradox is a valid, effective way to foster growth. It supports the widening of consciousness beyond the narrow confines of a tyrannical intellect, and it enriches life because only paradox comes anywhere near to comprehending the fullness of life. Brené Brown said, much to the shock of anybody who's talked to me in the last 2 months, I'm quoting Brené Brown. Brené Brown said, "I've been studying this skill about the transformative power of holding opposites. Knowing that two things that feel competing and conflicting can both be true, and how the ability to straddle these kinds of paradoxes really leads to transformation. And that in sustaining a paradox, I do think you can hold tension and create a whole new space by doing that, which is full of love and honesty and truth." Paradox, that space in the tension between two true things, is where transformation is possible. I am a wretched sinner, and I am forgiven and beloved. I have failed so often to love God and to love my neighbor and to love myself. And the kingdom is near. Every moment is alive with the possibility of giving and receiving the love for which we are made. And what is true at the cross is true over and over and over again in human hearts and in human lives. The paradox of hope and love victorious over the powers of death and destruction. It's foolishness. Utter foolishness. And yet the poets and storytellers and prophets and scholars all keep coming back to the same story. And that story is foolishness. We tell it to our children. One of the stories that I've watched and rewatched more times than I care to mention in the last year is The Dragon Prince on Netflix. It's a cartoon with magic and elves and dragons. And in this foolish story, the king, anticipating his death, writes a letter to his son. He says, "Advisors and scholars will tell you that history is a narrative of strength, and they will recount stories of the rise and fall of nations and empires. They will be stories of armies, battles, and decisive victories. But this isn't true strength. It is merely power. I now believe true strength is found in vulnerability, in forgiveness, in love. There is a beautiful upside-down truth, which is that these moments of purest strength appear as weakness to those who don't know better. For a long time, I didn't know better. I ask you and your brother to reject history as a narrative of strength and instead have faith that it can be a narrative of love." It's a good end to season 1. There are echoes there of another man, anticipating his death and trying to get those who would follow after him to see the world in a different way. To choose something other than the simplicity of action and reaction, aggression and counter-aggression, vengeance and destruction. To live in the paradox of the power of hope and of love. And the world doesn't want to hear it. Or rather, the world only wants to hear it in a children's story. so that when our children actually want to defy the powers of this world and to choose forgiveness or hope or love, we can tell them, oh, grow up. The simple story, the story of power and victory and might, that is so much easier to grasp and so much easier to comprehend and so much easier to sell. A simple solution and someone to blame. That is the wisdom of this world. Armies and battles and decisive victories. But that upside down truth, that paradox, is where transformation is possible. I am a wretched sinner, and I am forgiven and beloved. And I have failed so often to love God and to love my neighbor and to love myself, and the kingdom is near. And every moment is alive with the possibility of giving and receiving the love for which we are made. The message of the cross is a beautiful, complicated, paradoxical, upside-down truth in which forgiveness and love are the purest strength, and they appear as weakness to those who don't know better. And again, and again, and again, in the words of the prophets and the poets and the storytellers, in the words of the researchers and scholars and the students of human behavior, we are invited over and over again to remember that we know better. Thanks be to God.